So here we are. This is the first lecture on Chapter 11. Chapter 11 is on business cycles. And I've got several articles here from the Wall Street that I want to talk to you about. Some of them actually deal specifically with what chapters 11 and 12 is over. The first one here I've got the U.S. warns rivals over economic policies. This is from the Wall Street. The Obama administration delivered a shot across the bow to Asia's leading exporters and Germany for their economic policies and warned that a number of major economies around the globe could face intense pressure to engage in currency interventions to counter slow growth. So, intense pressure, what does it sound like? It sounds to me like, well, it's just a continuation of a currency war, right? So what is what is this article talking about? It's talking about a currency war. What's a currency war? A currency war is when nations devalue their currencies in order to increase exports. You increase yeah.
Is your mic on? Okay, that's a lot better. Thank you.
All right.
Sorry.
Okay. To increase exports to bring more money in. But of course, if we were all countries here and I devalued my currency and that hurt you and so you devalue your currency to bring more money into your country, and then Lisa devalues hers and Dimitri devalues his and Cole devalues his, and so what have we got here? You see, we have a currency war, and who wins a currency war? Nobody wins a currency war. Now, one point that this article makes here, it says U.S. officials are increasingly concerned other countries aren't doing enough to boost demand at home, relying too heavily on exports to bolster growth. So the point here is that we should have, what would solve the problem is to have more growth. All right. In fact, I've got an article just on growth. But instead of doing that, what have countries done? Countries have simply used monetary policies to increase the money supply by creating money, and relied on that to boost growth instead of making hard choices. See, how do we bring about growth? Well, you bring about growth by giving incentives to people who can grow the economy. Who is that? Well, mostly businesses. You have to have favorable tax laws.
Increase tariffs so they don't go take their business to Mexico.
Well, that would be another fault. I mean, see, that again is tariff war. I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm glad you mentioned that because a tariff war is similar to a trade war, similar to a currency war. And who wins a trade war? Nobody wins a trade war. Yeah. Everyone loses and no one gains. Now, remember from the last chapter, there are reasons why we would have trade restrictions, but to have trade restrictions for the sole reason of simply increasing your exports is a bad reason. It's only going to lead to more unemployment in all countries. And see, it says here, the calls for government action have grown louder as central banks reach deeper into their toolboxes, and each round of stimulus appears less effective than the last. Now, what this sounds like to me, there's an analogy here in that money, by simply creating the money to stimulate the economy, is like a person taking drugs. All right, and if you know anything about people who take drugs, when you get hooked on drugs, what happens to reach the high that you had in the past? You have to take more drugs. See, that's what this is. I mean, money is the same thing, and that's what they're saying here.
And it's untaxed.
Yeah, right. It says the calls for government action have grown louder as central banks reach deeper, stimulating the money supply even more to reach deeper into their toolboxes, and each round of stimulus appears less effective than the last. Now, does that sound like a person on drugs? And it says here, yet the latest attempts to boost job creation by loosening labor laws have sparked widespread protests. Now, what's one reason why governments have been unable to make hard choices to grow their economy? Because most of these economies are democracies. And what's one problem with a democracy?
It's not a republic.
Well, it's a republic. It's a democracy in a republic, as the United States is. We're a democracy in a republic. But but one of the problems with democracies is that in order to make the hard choices, you're going to have to do a lot of things that's going to be unpopular to the majority of the voters. You're going to have to maybe lower wages instead of raise wages, or you're going to have to put less money into social programs in order to put more money into programs that will stimulate growth. See, most of the things that a country would do to stimulate growth is unpopular to the average person. Now you see the problem we've got, and this is true for all countries. I mean, most countries anyway.
Isn't it because of outsourcing, though? Reduces jobs in the country.
Well, let's not get into anything specific like outsourcing. Let's stay on the subject here. It says here Thursday injury. There have been riots in Europe injuring police officers since the protests against labor overhauls began. 382 people have been arrested. Anyway, it's in the face of the protests, French president has backed off from bigger changes to labor laws. You see, if we change labor laws, like in France, they have very generous labor laws. People get a lot of vacation days and short work weeks, and there are minimum wage laws, and you see, all of these things are drag on growth. And so instead of relying on that, we rely on simply stimulating the economy through money creation. But that's near its end to. It's going to cause more problems than it really solves. And yet the population is against those things that would bring about long-term solutions. Another article here is on Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, is just defaulted on a debt payment. Puerto Rico has sold bonds which are paying about 8% interest. Now, with interest rates real low, 8% is a very good return. But what's the downside to getting this higher interest rate? Risk. And so a lot of people who've bought bonds from Puerto Rico now may not get any money back. I mean, let alone their principal and any interest. They're stand a chance of losing their money, or maybe getting only 50 cents on the dollar. See, that's risk involved. You can't lend your money to somebody and assume with 100% certainty that they're going to pay you back according to the agreement. Yeah.
Well, they were lobbying in Congress for Congress to force Puerto Rico to pay.
Yeah. There's
There's a bunch of investment firms.
Of course, investment firms who have bought the bonds, of course, want to get paid, but you can't take water from a stone, and that's a big problem. But I got another point to make here. It says Puerto Rico's president said in a televised address that the island was struggling to pay for such basic goods as fuel and police cars. Puerto Rico, whose residents are U.S. citizens, now this is pertinent here, has been mired in recession for a decade and borrowed heavily to balance budgets, despite the shaky economy. Of course, that just made matters worse. The borrowing spree, however, did little to create economic opportunity. Now, but here's the big point. They are struggling, and something has to be done well, we're never going to solve the situation, but the point I'm making is, I was reading this article, and I said, something's different here. Because what normally happens in this situation around the world? Well, what normally happens is the International Monetary Fund comes in, and it says, oh, well, you can't pay your debts, so let's make other arrangements. If you give us your mineral rights, for the next 100 years, or if you lower your social programs, spend less in your social programs, and give the difference to these international banks, or if you vote for in our way at the United Nations. I mean, there's all kinds of that's what the IMF does. It makes these alternative arrangements that eventually would the country loses its independence. But I kind of thought that when I was reading this article. And now here, listen to this last paragraph. It says here, Puerto Rico can't turn to the International Monetary Fund for assistance because it's not a country. So that's why this thing with Puerto Rico is so different than what's happening in Greece, because Puerto Rico is not a country. It's a protectorate it's not a state of America, but it's a protectorate of America. See, it's not a country, and it's not a state. See, it's kind of like almost a unique situation. But the situation is totally different than Greece, because Greece is a country, and so the Greece now is dealing with the International Monetary Fund, as with a lot of the other countries in Africa and Asia and Europe. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. Well, I have another one here. I haven't seen you for almost a week. So here's an article about the Consumer Financial Protection Agency, and that is part of what this chapter 11 and 12 deals with. But the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Agency was, remember, this is an agency that was brought into existence through an executive order. Now, according to the Constitution, these type of government agencies should come by way of Congress, or at least a cooperation between Congress and the President. And Congress would control the purse strings according to our Constitution. But is that the case with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau? No, it came into existence through an executive order, and its funding comes from the Federal Reserve. So, and something this article mentions, once the head of this agency, it has got almost absolute power, because he cannot even be replaced by the president. Even the president of the United States has no power. Like, whoever wins his next election, in terms of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and other such bureaus, it really doesn't make any difference, because the bureaus they're autonomous. They have power onto themselves, which is a big thing to realize. It says here, it says, readers are by now acquainted with the Bureau's habit of claiming racial bias in lending by guessing which borrowers are black based on merely last names and addresses. See, one thing the Bureau has done is that they've looked at banks, and they've looked at the addresses that the banks have made, people that the banks have made loans to, and based on people's last names and addresses, they've guessed that the bank was discriminating. And then they would fine them millions of dollars when no one has complained about anything, and there's no real proof of discrimination, only guesswork using last names and addresses. And this is just an example of the power that these regulatory agencies have. It says here, last week the federal judge slapped down the Bureau for investigating into college accreditation for which it had no legal authority. So these bureaus actually are meddling in affairs where they just do it because they want to do it or think they can do it. And so the question, of course, is neither the executive nor legislative branch exercise control over this burgeoning federal agencies. And so for the sake of liberty, integrity, of the separation of powers, we should, it's asking questions whether this whole thing is constitutional or not. I mean, we have to ask ourselves this question. I mean, are these agencies really constitutional? Anyway, I thought that was interesting. What else have I got here? I think that's it. Anyway, any questions about any of that? Okay, well, let's, I've got a video for you. It deals with, see, I'm kind of going to get into chapter 12 a little bit because I don't have time to cover 12. Where is this video? And this video talks about the cause and effects of the financial crisis of 2007-2008, which is what chapter 12 was all about, right? And then we'll talk a little bit about this. This is
What is the credit crisis? It's a worldwide financial fiasco involving terms you've probably heard, like subprime mortgages, collateralized debt obligations, frozen credit markets, and credit default swaps. Who's affected? Everyone. How did it happen? Here's how. The credit crisis brings two groups of people together, homeowners and investors. Homeowners represent their mortgages, and investors represent their money. These mortgages represent houses, and this money represents large institutions like pension funds, insurance companies, sovereign funds, mutual funds, etc. These groups are brought together through the financial system, a bunch of banks and brokers commonly known as Wall Street. While it may not seem like it, these banks on Wall Street are closely connected to these houses on Main Street. To understand how, let's start at the beginning. Years ago, the investors are sitting on their pile of money, looking for a good investment to turn into more money. Traditionally, they go to the U.S. Federal Reserve, where they buy treasury bills, believed to be the safest investment. But in the wake of the dot-com bust in September 11th, Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan lowers interest rates to only 1% to keep the economy strong. 1% is a very low return on investment, so the investors say, no thanks. On the flip side, this means banks on Wall Street can borrow from the Fed for only 1%. Add to that general surpluses from Japan, China, and the Middle East, and there's an abundance of cheap credit. This makes borrowing money easy for banks and causes them to go crazy with leverage. Leverage is borrowing money to amplify the outcome of a deal. Here's how it works. In a normal deal, someone with $10,000 buys a box for $10,000. He then sells it to someone else for $11,000. For a $1,000 profit, a good deal. But using leverage, someone with $10,000 would go borrow $990,000 more dollars, giving him $1 million in hand. Then he goes and buys 100 boxes with his $1 million and sells them to someone else for $1,100,000. Then he pays back his $990,000 plus $10,000 in interest. And after his initial $10,000, he's left with a $90,000 profit versus the other guy's $1,000. Leverage turns good deals into great deals. This is a major way banks make their money. So Wall Street takes out a ton of credit, makes great deals, and grows tremendously rich, and then pays it back. The investors see this and want a piece of the action, and this gives Wall Street an idea. They can connect the investors to the homeowners through mortgages. Here's how it works. A family wants a house, so they save for a down payment and contact a mortgage broker. The mortgage broker connects the family to a lender who gives them a mortgage. The broker makes a nice commission. The family buys a house and becomes homeowners. This is great for them because housing prices have been rising practically forever. Everything works out nicely. One day, the lender gets a call from an investment banker who wants to buy the mortgage. The lender sells it to him for a very nice fee. The investment banker then borrows millions of dollars and buys thousands more mortgages and puts them into a nice little box. This means that every month he gets the payments from the homeowners of all the mortgages in the box. Then he sicks his banker wizards on it to work their financial magic, which is basically cutting it into 3 slices: safe, okay, and risky. They pack the slices back up in the box and call it a collateralized debt obligation, or CDO. A CDO works like 3 cascading trays. As money comes in, the top tray fills first, then spills over into the middle, and whatever is left into the bottom. The money comes from homeowners paying off their mortgages. If some owners don't pay and default on their mortgage, less money comes in and the bottom tray may not get filled. This makes the bottom tray riskier and the top tray safer. To compensate for the higher risk, the bottom tray receives a higher rate of return, while the top receives a lower, but still nice return. To make the top even safer, banks will insure it for a small fee called a credit default swap. The banks do all of this work so that credit rating agencies will stamp the top slice as a safe AAA rated investment, the highest, safest rating there is. The OK slice is BBB, still pretty good, and they don't bother to rate the risky slice. Because of the AAA rating, the investment banker can sell the safe slice to the investors who only want safe investments. He sells the OK slice to other bankers, and the risky slices to hedge funds and other risk takers. The investment banker makes millions. He then repays his loans. Finally, the investors have found a good investment for their money, much better than the 1% treasury bills. They're so pleased they want more CDO slices. So the investment banker calls up the lender, wanting more mortgages. The lender calls up the broker for more homeowners, but the broker can't find anyone. Everyone that qualifies for a mortgage already has one, but they have an idea.
Just swap mortgages.
When homeowners default on their mortgage, the lender gets the house, and houses are always increasing in value. Since they're covered if the homeowners default, lenders can start adding risk to new mortgages, not requiring down payments, no proof of income, no documents at all. And that's exactly what they did. So instead of lending to responsible homeowners, called prime mortgages, they started to get some that were, well, less responsible. These are subprime mortgages. This is the turning point. So, just like always, the mortgage broker connects the family with a lender and a mortgage, making his commission. The family buys a big house. The lender sells the mortgage to the investment banker, who turns it into a CDO and sells slices to the investors and others. This actually works out nicely for everyone and makes them all rich. No one was worried because as soon as they sold the mortgage to the next guy, it was his problem. If the homeowners were to default, they didn't care. They were selling off their risk to the next guy and making millions, like playing hot potato with a time bomb. Not surprisingly, the homeowners default on their mortgage, which at this moment is owned by the banker. This means he forecloses and one of his monthly payments turns into a house. No big deal. He puts it up for sale. But more and more of his monthly payments turn into houses. Now there are so many houses for sale on the market, creating more supply than there is demand, and housing prices aren't rising anymore. In fact, they plummet. This creates an interesting problem for homeowners still paying their mortgages. As all the houses in their neighborhood go up for sale, the value of their house goes down, and they start to wonder why they're paying back their $300,000 mortgage when the house is now worth only $90,000. They decide that it doesn't make sense to continue paying, even though they can afford to, and they walk away from their house. Default rates sweep the country, and prices plummet. Now the investment banker is basically holding a box full of worthless houses. He calls up his buddy, the investor, to sell his CDO, but the investor isn't stupid and says, no thanks. He knows that the stream of money isn't even a dribble anymore. The banker tries to sell to everyone, but nobody wants to buy his bomb. He's freaking out because he borrowed millions, sometimes billions of dollars to buy this bomb, and he can't pay it back. Whatever he tries, he can't get rid of it. But he's not the only one. The investors have already bought thousands of these bombs. The lender calls up trying to sell his mortgage, but the banker won't buy it, and the broker is out of order. The whole financial system is frozen, and things get dark. Everybody starts going bankrupt.
No, it just got interesting.
But that's not all. The investor calls up the homeowner and tells him that his investments are worthless. And you can begin to see how the crisis flows in a cycle. Welcome to the crisis of credit.
And that's our our modern financial system.
Can we watch it again?
Well, it's online. It's one of the links that goes with chapter 12. But that's what 11 and 12 is all about. One point that he made that may be correct in some cases. A collateralized debt obligation, as you just saw, was when you put a bunch of mortgages into this like box, and a lot of those mortgages were very high risk. In fact, back in 2004 or 5, we actually had what are called liar loans, where people could actually borrow money to buy a house and lie on their application. It's called Alt-A loans. If you had a job flipping burgers for McDonald's, but you went in and you wanted to borrow money to buy a house, and you said you made no background checks. You made $100,000. Well, they would say they would take that at face value and lend you money based on a salary of $100,000 when you're only making maybe $25,000 a year. Now those were actually a type of loan, and it was legal. And so the point is that we were lending money to people who obviously would never be able to pay it back. But of course, what difference does it make to a bank? Because a bank takes a loan and then it sells it right away, like to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. And so who cares if the person can't pay back the loan? The bank already has their money. Within hours of making the loan, the bank already has their money plus a tidy return on their investment.
There's no moral hazard for them because they know they can't bail?
Well, the moral hazard comes in when, and that's actually what happened. The government came in and bailed,
I didn't know that.
all these big banks out. But let me finish the story, and then like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac buy these mortgages, and then they put them into these CDOs, and they sell them off piecemeal. And Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac still do this. This is just modern finance. Now, a lot of these loans, a lot of these mortgages in this box, especially back before the financial collapse of 2007, 2008, were these very high risk type loans where it was obvious that people were going to default. So you say, well, why would someone buy a mortgage when it's going to be obviously there's going to be a default, or how can a CDO be rated AAA by Standard & Poor's and Moody's and Fitch and by the credit agencies? And the answer is because of credit default swaps. Now, credit default swaps is very simple. It sounds complicated, but it's very simple. A credit default swap is simply an insurance. Like what happens with owners of these CDOs, they would go to someone like IGA, and they would make a deal with IGA, an insurance company, and they would say, we'll pay you X amount of money if you take on the risk of a default. That's why it's called a credit default swap. See, it's a credit document that we're going to swap to someone else in case of default. Credit default swap. And so IGA sells this insurance, and people, banks pay them money. Say, well, now if we collect the money, then you just keep. If we collect the money from these homeowners, well, you just keep the money we paid you because it was like buying insurance. When you buy insurance, if you don't use that insurance, you don't get your money back, right? I mean, you buy the insurance and that money is gone, whether something bad happens or not, right? Well, it's same like with these banks. The banks paid AIG this insurance money, and AIG was making a whole bunch of money for a while, and so then AIG has a AAA credit rating. Now here's the point. Standard & Poor and Moody's and Fitch look at the CDO, and despite the junk in the CDO, these high risk type mortgages, they rate it AAA. Why do they rate it AAA? Because the CDO has bought a credit default swap from someone like AIG, and AIG has a AAA credit rating, and AIG says, well, if there's a default here, we'll make good on that default. So because AIG has a AAA credit rating, then these credit rating agencies rated these CDOs AAA, which made it easy for people who were selling these CDOs to sell to investors, because they said, look, the mortgages in this CDO are all rated AAA by Standard & Poor's or Moody's or Fitch, and therefore there's very little risk to you when you buy this. Y'all follow me on this? Of course, what happened? Well, AIG sold a whole lot more insurance than they had money to pay. I mean, they just sold. I mean, they were not regulated because of the nature of the thing, and so there was no how you say. See, normally banks are restricted from lending too much money out based on their assets, but with the AIG there was no government oversight in this, so they sold this insurance way beyond their potential of making good if anything really bad happened. And of course, that's what happened. Something real bad did happen. There were major defaults, and so all these big banks, despite a credit default swap is only good to the point where the seller of the credit default swap can make good on the payments. But the collapse was so pervasive that all these big banks, including AIG and others, went bankrupt. And of course, what happened? Well, then what happened is that the government came in and took taxpayer money to bail these big banks and corporations out. Now notice here that the people, the little guy who was caught up in all this, that was encouraged by, to buy houses and to go into debt, the money didn't go to the little guy, it went to the big banks and like AIG and other big corporations, which well, I don't want to get too far afield here, but
what happened to Bernie Madoff? What did he do?
Well, that's something different. That was a Ponzi scheme. He sold a Ponzi scheme is like our Social Security system.
It's just like
a Ponzi scheme is when you convince someone that you can give them a return on their money, but instead of investing the money, you get new people to enter into the program, and you take their money to pay the first people, and then to pay the second group, you have a third group that enters, and you take part of their money to give. And so as long as more and more people enter the system, because none of the money is really invested, as long as you got more and more people entering the system, then everybody gains. But eventually you run out of people, and the system falters, which is exactly what will happen to our Social Security, because the government doesn't save any of the money that we pay into Social Security, and that none of the money is invested, and all the money that's paid out has to come from people who pay into Social Security. But if when we get to the point where you got more people receiving than paying, then the system collapses. That's what a Ponzi scheme is. That's what Bernie Madoff did, and that's why he's in prison.
Yeah, the ministry.
But no one's going to send the government to prison for doing the same thing.
And it's funny how he's like almost the only person that actually went to jail for anything that happened.
Well, see, now that brings it to another point. When we had the savings and loan crisis in the 60s, there were hundreds of bankers that went to jail, went to prison, but not one person, because of the all this shenanigans that went off, lending money to people that could never pay it back, and defrauds and all the other things that happened. Not one person has ever gone to prison. And of course, now the answer to that is because who is in Bureau of Justice Department? Yeah, who's in charge of prosecuting people who are doing harm or doing breaking the law? It's the Department of I just had it in my mind. Department of Justice.
Or the IRS.
No, Department of Justice. Department of Justice. So if you have the person, the person who's in charge of the Department of Justice, if they previously were a top CEO for Goldman Sachs, then are they going to be in a position to prosecute Goldman Sachs for unlawful acts? And the answer is no. And that's why no banker or anyone else has gone to prison for all the things that happened leading to the financial collapse of 2007, 2008. See, it's not even the President of the United States. This is another example of how power in our system is not really centralized, but it's in all these different agencies, and the Department of Justice it is their responsibility to prosecute people who are dealing in illegalities. But if they choose not to get involved, then no one else has the authority to do it. So all that power to decide of whether they're going to prosecute or not is in the hands of one person. Now, y'all find that interesting? There was a good article on this in the Wall Street not too long ago about the Department of Justice. Anyway, so let's get back to these slides then. Let's see, slideshow from beginning. Here we got chapter 11, business cycles. Oh, by the way, one thing I forgot to mention at the very beginning, we were talking about growth earlier, and how countries have not made the hard choices that would lead to growth, but instead have simply created money, relied on monetary policies to stimulate the economy. Well, the point I want to make is, why is growth so important? Now, that brings us way back to chapter 2. Chapter 2 was a chapter on growth. And back then, I talked a lot about this, but why is growth so important? Growth is important because things wear out. In our physical world, things deteriorate. And if we don't grow to replace what we've got, then do we have tomorrow what we have today? No, we don't. We have less tomorrow than we do today. Why? Because things deteriorate, right? See, that's why growth is so important. So if we don't make the hard choices, if we don't have laws that may not be popular amongst the majority of the people, but yet those laws would lead to growth. You see, eventually, as we grow and we increase productivity, then we can increase what we have, and the pie gets larger, and we can therefore, ultimately almost everyone gains. But the journey there may be painful. All right. But if people don't understand this, don't understand economics, and don't understand why growth is important, then when you have a democracy and people rise up against any changes or any change of the labor laws, for example, that might lead to more growth, well, once a politician maybe takes some hard choices, they just vote him out of office, or there's a revolution, or whatever. There's a change in government in a not so orderly fashion, and so what do we get? Well, we get eventually growth not only slows down, but the pie gets smaller and smaller and smaller. See, that's what's happened in Greece. That's what's happened in Puerto Rico. That's what's happened in a lot of these countries.
Wait, did Puerto Rico default?
Yeah, just yesterday.
Like on Monday, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I just thought I'd mention that. All this is related to what we're talking about here. What are the four phases of the business cycle? The peak. Now, a lot of what I do in Chapter 11, by the way, there's some new material, but a lot of it is a review, and I meant for it to be this way. We're at the end, of the book, at the end of the course, and so some of this material is sort of a tying together of things that we've talked about in the past. And another reason for Chapter 11 is that it is it takes us into Chapter 12, which then Chapter 12 is primarily on the financial collapse of 2007-2008, with comparisons of what's happening today. So that's what Chapter 11 is all about. It's so some of these things that we talk about, we've talked about before. And we've talked about the peak, and then of course the economy eventually goes into recession. We hit a trough, which is the bottom, and then we go into recovery, and then we reach a peak, and then we go into recession. And so that's what business cycle is. Now, can we eliminate the business cycle? Well, back in the 60s, with Keynesian economics being so popular, it was actually believed that if we use the correct monetary and fiscal policies, if we could manage demand, that's what Keynesian economics is all about. If we can manage demand, we can manage the economy. That was the whole idea, that we could eliminate the business cycle and have a perpetual growth. But back then the 70s hit, and we learned that it's not really possible. I don't think even the staunchest Keynesian now would believe that we could eliminate the business cycle. So the business cycle is with us, and the point is that change is inevitable. Change in life is inevitable. Change in the economy is inevitable. Things are going to get better. Things are going to get worse. Things are going to get better. Things are going to get worse. And if you think that we can eliminate that and have just things get better and better and better all the time, the world doesn't work that way. All right? This is an important realization. That this is why Austrians don't get so upset, when we have a minor downturn in the economy. I mean, it's, downturns are normal. Okay? It's just like in life. Life is there are disappointments in life, and there are ups and downs in life, and there are bumps in the road, as we say. I mean, that's life isn't a smooth road; it's a very bumpy road. And same with the economy. Now, what causes unemployment? Anytime, anywhere, unemployment is caused by excessive inventories. See, why would a business lay off workers? Because a business isn't going to keep on producing something if it already has too much. How does it know it has too much? Well, all businesses have inventory. Inventory is good. Inventory are goods that are produced but not yet sold. And a certain amount of inventory is necessary. But if a business, let's say, has inventory of 1,000 units in their warehouse, and they're producing 1,000 units and they're selling 1,000 units, then there's always 1,000 units of inventory. But if demand drops and they only sell 900 units one month, and the next month they only sell 700 units, and the difference of their production and what they sell is put in the warehouse, well, what's happening in the warehouse? Well, you started with 1,000, then you got 1,200, now you got 1,500 units, and then you see, inventory is building up in the warehouse. So what does a business owner, what's the first thing on their mind? The first thing on their mind is to cut production in order that their inventory in their warehouse not keep building up and up and up. But once you cut production, what does that mean? Well, that means more unemployment. That means you got to lay off workers. So what was the cause of the unemployment? The cause of the unemployment was the excessive inventory. Excessive inventory is inventory above and beyond what's really desired. Okay, now, then the question is, well, what caused that excessive inventory? And the answer to that question is it depends on what period of history you're talking about. Back in the 30s, what caused excessive inventory was the belief on business people that if they kept prices high and wages low, that would lead to perpetual increases in profit. But what was the problem to that way of thinking? Well, if you keep wages low and prices high, and you produce more and more and more, what has got to happen?
Your demand goes down?
No, you keep wages low and prices high, and you produce more and more and more. You put more money back in the bit. I mean, what's going to happen? Excessive inventory, right?
Yeah, you have to.
Yeah, people aren't going to have the buying power to buy everything that you're producing. And once you have excessive inventory, what happened? You get more unemployment, right? Now, what is the thought today that could lead to the same result? In other words, back in the 20s, there was a mistaken belief that we could have perpetual growth and higher profits if we kept wages low and prices as high as possible. But that was an erroneous belief. We believed in a lie, and when you believe in a lie, eventually everything collapses. Well, what lie do we believe in today?
Wages high and prices
No.
low.
Or quantitative easing.
Yes, Cole's got it. The answer is quantitative easing. That's the lie that countries believe in today. They believe that through quantitative easing, through the creation of money, through these monetary policies alone, that they can bring about perpetual growth. Now, is that possible? No, it's not. That's a lie. And when you take action based on a lie, you're going to have a collapse. Y'all with me on this? Okay, well, I can get a lot out of that one slide, can't I? What causes inflation? Now, this is a review, right? Now, most people, the general explanation of inflation is that you've got too much money chasing too few goods. When you increase the money supply, more the increased goods and services, then you'll get inflation. But you now know that that the money supply is only one factor that determines the price level. What are the other two factors that determine the price level? Well, one factor beside the money supply is velocity. Now, what is velocity? Velocity is how quickly a dollar changes hands. Okay? If a dollar changes hands quickly, people get money and they spend it, and someone else gets it and they spend it right away, and that's velocity. So if the money supply stayed the same but velocity increased, what would happen to the average price? What would happen to the general price level? It would go up. If velocity went down, if the money supply stayed the same but the velocity went down, then the price level will come down. See, so the velocity of money is a factor of inflation as well as the money supply. And then the third factor that determines the rate of inflation is quantity, and quantity is gross domestic product or growth. So if the number of goods and if everything else being equal, if the number of goods and services that the economy produces increases, what's going to happen to the price level? Well, when things become more plentiful and there's more to go around for everybody, as people bid against one another, what's going to happen? Price is going to go down, right? There's plenty for everybody, so the intensity of people bidding against one another for scarce resources is lessened when we have more, right? So when quantity goes up, what happens to the general price level? It goes down. And that's why Q is in the denominator. See, this says M times V divided by Q equals the general price level. All right? So you have to understand what, inflation is caused by, these three factors, not just the money supply. And again, this is a review. If the increase in if considering velocity and Q, if you're talking about inflation, you're talking about inflation in a particular country, right? It's a system. Like if you're talking about the American dollar, if you're talking about America, then you might say, well, what causes inflation in America? Or if you're talking about Europe, you talk about the euro, and then you'd have Europe, the countries that support the euro is like a sphere. Okay, the America is like a sphere. And we only get inflation if you increase the money supply more than you increase goods and services. We're talking about increasing the money supply within that sphere. Now, because we practice quantitative easing, and for years we've been creating about $80 billion a month out of thin air. That's a lot of money, and we did that for years. Why has that not caused inflation? It hasn't reached us. It hasn't got into the sphere. At least not a lot of it. Most of it has gone elsewhere. Like where elsewhere? Well, like other parts of the world.
What if it does get into the sphere?
Well, then that's a good question. When it does get into the sphere, then we will have, considering velocity and Q, of course, we will have more inflation.
What if velocity is low, even though it's in the stream?
Well, that's what I mean. Assuming V and Q are constant, everything else being equal, we say in economics, then when that money, that will happen. These newly created money eventually will come home, and it will cause inflation at some point.
Didn't you make the example of Japan having deflation because of velocity, low velocity?
Well, I don't remember saying that, but that makes sense. Yeah, the velocity is, when the economy experiences more unemployment, you're going to get lower velocity. But here's the point: where has a lot of this money gone? If through quantitative easing. Now, we used to call it monetizing the debt, but how come now we call it quantitative easing? Sounds better, exactly. Right, and that's what we do often. We just, when things become unpopular, we just change the terminology, change the name. But anyway, where has a lot of this, if you call it quantitative easing, instead of the money getting into the system, a lot of it's gone into other countries, and a lot of it's gone where? Into the derivatives market. And how big is the derivatives market? It's a $600 trillion worldwide market. $600 trillion. Now our national debt is close to $20 trillion, and that is huge. How many Citibank, one American bank, owes $62 trillion in the derivatives market. That one bank, $62 trillion. The whole U.S. economy, the GDP in 1 year is only $17 trillion. And we've got one American bank that's got $62 trillion invested in the derivatives market. Deutsche Bank has got $75 trillion in the derivatives market. And what is the derivatives market? It's simply, that's all it is. It's simply two people making a bet on the outcome of some future event. That's all it is. You can bet on the weather. You can bet on the valuations of different currencies. You can bet on the horses. You can bet on greyhounds. You can, you know what I mean? It's just two people or two organizations making a bet on the outcome of some future event. And wait a minute, I'll get to you. And you're going to have a winner and you're going to have a loser. But now, what makes the derivatives market so dangerous? What makes it so dangerous is not only are people betting in the trillions of dollars, but a good portion of that betting is borrowed money. The derivatives market is heavy on leverage. And like this video that you just saw, leverage can be a good thing in the short run, but when things start to head south, then person A can't pay B, and person B can't pay C, and it's a dominoes effect, and you get this mushroom, this total collapse. And that's what's going to happen with the derivatives market. I mean, it's been held up so far because the amount of defaults have been minimal. But once the general worldwide economy starts to head south, you're going to get a lot of people in the derivatives market that, I can't make good on my payment, and so I'm going to have to sell this and sell that, or I'm going to simply have to default, and so we get this huge. I mean, the collapse that we could have would make the 2007-2008 seem minor. Are y'all with me on this? I mean, this is the last week I've got you, right? I'm trying to make a point here. Yeah, you had a question?
So is the Forex market considered derivative?
I don't know.
Like the betting, like you buy a certain country's currency expecting it to go down.
Oh yeah. That's derivatives market. Yeah, in fact, that's probably the biggest sector.
Okay.
I mean, people betting on the valuations of currencies is the most popular thing to bet on in the derivatives market.
And would the stock market also be considered in the derivatives?
No, that's something different. No, that's something different. The word derivative comes from the word derive, and so, if you and I want to make a bet on some future event, the outcome of some future event, we would make our agreement on a piece of paper. I would say this is going to happen, and you would say that's going to happen, and we would put a date on it. And we would put how much we are wagering, and so that this piece of paper is now a legal document. All right, and so if I lose the bet, and I don't pay you, you can go to a court authority and say, look, Professor Long owes me this money, and here's the proof. Here's this piece of paper. Here's the proof. Well, what is that piece of paper? That piece of paper is a derivative. All right, that's what derivatives are. They're legal contracts between two people. Now, let's say you and I enter into this bet, and we wagered, $10,000, so that whoever is on winning side of this derivative collects $10,000 from the other person. Well, how much value does that piece of paper have? $10,000. Where did that value come from? It came from nowhere. It came from thin air. See, by us entering into this agreement with this derivative, that you and I have brought into existence value out of thin air, and that piece of paper, that derivatives, has a legal foundation. Y'all find this interesting? Anyway, that's the derivatives market. Something else I was going to say, but I forget. Anyway, now stagflation is when the economy is stagnating and inflating at the same time, like we had during the 1970s. Now, what caused the stagflation of the 70s? Now, I'm asking a lot of questions because I'll allow this just a review. What causes stagflation? The shift to the left of the aggregate supply curve. When supply curve shifts, aggregate supply curve, and the word aggregate means a summation of, or the totality. When the aggregate supply curve for the economy shifts to the left, I mean, if you got a downward sloping demand curve, an upward sloping supply curve, price on the vertical axis, quantity, GDP on the horizontal axis, when supply shifts to the left, you get higher prices and lower GDP. Well, what is that? Well, that's what we had in the 70s, right? We had rising unemployment, Q was decreasing, and yet we had rising prices. What's the only way that can occur? With the aggregate supply curve shifting to the left. Well, what causes the aggregate supply curve to shift to the left?
Cost inflation.
Yes, costs. That's the key word. When costs increase, If you owned a business and your cost increased, what would happen to your ability to supply? It would go down. When costs increase, now if we have slower growth, right? If we have slower growth and our machines start to wear out, we don't replace them, because that's what growth is, right? Growth is replacing the old with the new, but we're not doing that because we're not growing. Well, as our factories and machines and our roads and our infrastructure gets older, what happens to the cost of maintaining this stuff? Goes up. What happens to the aggregate supply curve? Shifts to the left. What do we get? Stagflation. And can you solve stagflation through typical Keynesian demand management policies? No. Why? Because it's not a demand problem, it's a supply problem, and can only be solved with supply remedies, right? And what is the solution? The solution is to institute laws and regulations that have a tax system that is favorable to growth. That's the solution. But why is the solution not an easy solution to implement? Because of our democracy, right? Because there is pain involved, especially of less low income or even moderate income, even the middle class. There's pain involved when you say, no, we're not going to spend this money in a social program, we're going to spend it so that we're not any better off today, but we're going to invest it so we're better off tomorrow. But people say, well, I don't want to be worse off today. Let someone else bear the pain, right? I mean, that's what's happening everywhere. And so we're getting riots, and we're getting changes of, politicians are unable. It's not that they don't want to make the hard choices, but they're unable to make the hard choices because any politician makes the hard choices is going to be either thrown out of office or voted out of office. And that's the situation we're in, not only in America, but worldwide. Y'all with me on this? Okay, well, we're about running out of time. Let's see, and of course, here's the picture that we were talking about. See, if we don't grow, because our machines, our buildings, our infrastructure get older, get more expensive to maintain, aggregate supply shifts to the left, get higher prices, lower Q. What is Q? Q is GDP. When Q goes down, we get more unemployment. And what's the solution to this problem? The solution is to shift this aggregate supply curve back to the right. But that requires hard choices. It requires pain, because we have to sacrifice today in order to have more tomorrow. See? But there's a lot of people don't want to sacrifice, and they got their vote to make sure we don't, at least the sacrifice doesn't hit them. And of course, everyone feels the same, or most everyone. And why can't I? Well, I can't. Let's call it a day. I didn't get very far on this, but I'll finish this next time. And so I'll see you all next time for the last lecture.
Okay.